The sauna is a magical place. You can have children in it. It can cure any disease. It can create political agreements. You can have a funeral in it. You can sort out disagreements between friends. Truly, it is a magical place. At least, that is what we Finns believe. And that is part of our cultural identity and why we have myths, stories that we tell about the sauna. In a fantasy world, it can often seem overwhelming to create such mythology that speaks to who a culture is, that tells stories that is authentic to that culture. And that's what I want to break down today in a long conversation that we'll have in the sauna. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. So today's video is going to be a little different from usual. I don't have my normal fairly tight script. I have a whole bunch of talking points that I want to discuss specifically about creating myths. And that was sparked by a comment left on a post where I asked, what series of world building do you want me to cover next? What series of videos do you want me to make next? And one of my audience asked for myth making. Now, I don't have enough content, I think, to make like a full series to cover things I haven't yet said, because I have spoken about myths in general and heroic myths and so on. But what the person was asking for specifically was creating myths that have meaning, creating myths that have cultural resonance. So that got me thinking about a whole lot of points, not the least of which is that I was recently reading somebody's unpublished work, and we were discussing a myth that they had included in their work. And that myth was based on Ursula K. Le Guin's Those Who Walk Away from Omelos. Now, if you've not read that particular essay, let me just give you a brief recap. Essentially, the city of Omelos is a utopian city. Everything is fantastic there. But in order to keep it running as a utopia, there is a child that is left in the dark. The child is never loved, never cared for, fed once a day, and otherwise left to cry alone in the dark. And if they don't do that, the city won't have a utopia. Every person in the city is taken to see the child once in their life so that they know the cost of the city. And their choice is either to stay in the city or to walk away. And so the story is called Those Who Walk Away from Omelos, because there are those who just leave the city, who refuse to participate in the city that is based on this mistreatment of this child. And this author had used a derivation of that myth as a myth told in a culture based on Confucius's values, Confucianism, right? And I couldn't square this as a myth that would grow out of a Confucian philosophy structure. And here's the reason why, right? That myth, the story of Those Who Walk Away from Omelos, is inspired by Jotsky's, the Russian guy. I'll put his name over here somewhere. The Russian guy's philosophy about a scapegoat. So, and it's centered on this mythology of individualism, right? It is about utilitarian philosophy, which was born out of the Renaissance and is about the individual, sacrificing one so that all the others can have many, and so on. But Confucian philosophy is centered around collectivism, right? A society cannot be just unless it is just on all levels. Relationships and the way in which people interact with each other is a paramount form of morality. The roles people play in society. So, in a Confucian tradition, the myth of Omelas would never arise. It would never even be a question asked in Confucian philosophy, because the obvious and instantaneous answer is no, this society that mistreats this child is obviously unjust. Because if your corruption exists on the level where you are supposed to be taking care of a child and you do not, nothing you build up on this corruption can be just. Okay, so they don't have a tradition of the scapegoat in Confucius philosophy, and the scapegoat is central to those who walk away from Omelas. And so we had this back and forth about this myth and why it didn't work in his culture, in this world of his. And that is the core of what I want to discuss here today, is that how important it is to build myths that don't just on a surface level, on a names and places, sound as though they could fit a philosophy, but myths that fit the culture top to bottom. Okay, so myths mirror morals, and making sure that your morals work within your myth, that the question asked by the myth matches your moral framework of your culture, is the first thing that you need to think about. And then what I've already touched on here is those four pillars of a culture, the four core pillars of a culture, how important it is that the myth speaks to them. So you can check out my video on those four core pillars of a culture if you want to go into that in detail. But let's just go through them in terms of the actual building of a mythology. Okay, so the first column is hierarchy versus egalitarianism. And here I want to talk about the Chinese myth of Pahu, the first dog. If you've never heard this myth, it's a spectacular one. So there is an emperor who, a king, sorry, this is before empress. There's a king in southern China who has an old woman in his court that has an earache. He's trying to cure this earache, and a wizard draws a worm, a golden worm, out of the woman's ear and puts it into a jar, and out of this jar is born Pahu, the first dog, who was a very, very good boy. So the king had this requirement in another city, and I seem to have not written down exactly what it was that the king needed, but the dog Pahu went. The king offered a reward for this deed of his daughter's hand in marriage, and Pahu went racing off to go do this deed the king wanted, and then came back and was a very sad boy when the king didn't give Pahu his hand in marriage, his daughter's hand in marriage. And The king was like, but you're a dog. And Pahu was like, I can fix that. So he gets back into the jar, and it's like, okay, nobody peek for 7 days, and Pahu will come out as a man and, claim the king's daughter's hand in marriage. But on the 6th day, the daughter is too curious, and she opens the jar because she's worried that Pahu might starve to death, right? So she opens the jar and looks inside, and Pahu's still got his dog head on, but now the transformation's been stopped, so now he's stuck with his head on, and she ends up marrying a man with a dog's head. In the Chinese culture, this myth is about hierarchical obedience and patience. Okay? So the king made a promise that he would give his daughter's hand in marriage, and then he didn't. And that is a bad thing, as shown by the dog's sadness. And then we have the daughter who disobeys the injunction of, waiting for 7 days. And because she doesn't wait for 7 days, the myth punishes her by marrying her to a man with a dog's head. So it's basically about enforcing hierarchical obedience and patience, where even royal blood must submit to ritual and timing. Now, contrast that with the more egalitarian myths, like in my country, in the Finnish Kalevala, we have Wainamoinen, the first man, who's effectively like singing things into being, and leadership within the Kalevala is often earned through power and deeds, right? So that is a more meritocratic society, a far less hierarchical society. So that pillar between hierarchy and egalitarianism, the myth sways backwards and forwards, punishing different people and rewarding different people depending on their behavior within the cultural context. So our second pillar is collectivism versus individualism. And again, in the Chinese myths, there's often an emphasis on stability and endurance. Whereas in the Kalevala myths, which are more individualistic, though not as individualistic as our modern world, we have a much bigger embrace of freedom. Heroes wander, they defy, they innovate. Wainamoinen doesn't always succeed, but his struggles are creative acts. And then in terms of tradition versus progress, traditional cultures mythologize primordial origins, sacred repetitions. For example, in Chinese mythology, the story of Nuwa repairing the sky reflects tradition, not innovation. Progressive cultures, like those found in the post-Incan mythic fragments, may celebrate human mastery over the divine, like the elevation of Pachacuti, who was the world changer king. I hope I said that right. So, think of those 4 pillars when you're creating your myths. How does the myth tie back to your culture's score on those 4 pillars? Okay, so remember, they're sliding scales, right? So no culture is fully traditional or fully progressive, right? They're either like, they're somewhere on that scale of like how much change they can tolerate. Think about their score in any given part of one of those pillars when you're designing the myths. Okay, so here are 5 core things to consider when creating your myths. First, what moral lessons should the myth teach? Is the goal obedience? Is it cunning? Is it sacrifice, patience, victory through struggle? every culture elevates certain virtues. Your myth should reinforce the virtues of the culture you're creating. Who gets punished? Who gets rewarded? In Confucian-influenced myths, the disobedient daughter is punished. In Norse myths, the bold, like Thor, is celebrated. This shows what the culture tolerates and fears in terms of punishment and reward for virtues. What role does power play in the myth, and where does that power come from? Is power inherited through hierarchy? Is it earned through meritocracy? Is it granted by spirits, so a traditional power source, as in your ancestors give you power, taking you to obeying your ancestors? Is it seized, emphasizing individualism? Your myth should reflect who deserves power by the culture's ethos and why. How does the myth frame community versus self? Does the hero save the world by sacrifice, or does he rebel and walk away? Omelas fails the collectivist test. Myths like Panhu reward aligning with societal roles. And how does the myth explain the world? Myths explain why things are the way they are. Why does the king have power and so on? Use the myths to anchor cultural norms. If divorce, for example, is taboo within your culture, have a myth about a goddess who split from her husband and caused winter in the land. Your myths don't exist in a vacuum. They are the collective dreams and fears of your world's people, shaped by their values, their ideologies, and their place in the cosmic orders. To build great myths, you must let them grow from the soil of your culture, not dropped into place from our world without any context. And that's why I always say, understand the context of the culture that you're using as inspiration. Because if you don't, you will not build myths that feel real to that culture. Okay, so that's all very cool and great and high level, but how do you, for realses, build myths and make that a reality in your world? Okay, so let's talk about Carl Jung. Now, Jung's got his issues, you know. He probably would have thought I was a talking dog, at least if you look at the way he writes. Women don't feature very, that we don't, my gender, we don't come off so great in Jung's philosophy. But that doesn't mean that we should toss the baby out with the bathwater. The man had some good thoughts and some good analysis of the world. First, let me, I guess, briefly just explain like what Jung deconstructed myths into. There's the self, okay, that's the hero of the story. Then the hero has an anima and an animus, okay. The anima is female, the animus is male, man and woman. And the animus is rational and, wise. And the anima, the female side, is intuitive and emotional, because men are never emotional, never moody. Anyway, I promise I'll let it go. It's okay. I do appreciate Jung for his insight, even if he was the way he was. Okay. So there's the anima and the animus, and then there is the shadow. Okay, so the shadow is the reflection of the hero that must be faced. It is the parts of ourselves that we don't want to look at, right? It is also the parts of society that we don't want to look at, the unacknowledged evil parts that the myths force us to confront. And in this case, I mean evil as in what that society sees as evil. The anima and animus, don't take them as necessarily tied to the gender identity, right? You can, if you like, but it can be tied to any opposing identities within your culture. And remember, I did an episode on creating identities and culture, which you can check out in the information card. But any two opposing identities can be your anima and your animus in your myths, right? And using them makes your myths more core. It makes your stories more core to your culture, communicating what your culture finds relevant. All right, so let's take an example of Star Wars, which is a nearly textbook perfect use of Jungian stereotypes. All right, so we have Luke, who is the self. His anima and his animus, in my opinion, is represented by by Han and by Leia. Han represents the rebel identity, and he is a smuggler and he is a free man. Leia represents the duty and the sacrifice, right? Now, you could also see Han as a sort of a shadow to Luke, like the rebel, that the desire to walk away, and that must be confronted and that must be changed. And that is a very valid analysis, but you can also see Luke and Han as two contrasting selves, two contrasting identities within Luke that must be resolved. Now, Darth Vader is undoubtedly the shadow. Okay, so Darth Vader represents the fall to the dark side, and Luke must confront Vader in order to grow beyond him and achieve his status as a Jedi Master. And the reason why Star Wars, at least I think the reason why Star Wars resonates so deeply and why it has stood the test of time so much, is because of this really excellent use of the Jungian stereotypes, because of the mirror of Darth Vader to Luke Skywalker, because of the contrasts offered by Luke and Han, and how they both integrate within Luke, and how he must essentially join the two together to become a strong, powerful Jedi Master and bring peace to the galaxy. So that's Jungian stereotypes and the four core parts that I would say a world builder needs to know: the self, the shadow, the anima, and the animus. And as I said, don't get caught up too much in the gender of the anima and the animus. Think about them in terms of conflicting identities. Whatever conflicting identities you have within your cultures, assign one set of attributes to the anima and one to the animus, and let them be that conflict between identities. So when you're writing your myths using Jungian types, if I just glance at my notes over here, as I say, I don't have my normal scripts, but I do, have notes. So ask what opposing forces are tearing your culture apart. Then embody those in the anima and the animus and the shadow figures. And remember that the hero doesn't have to destroy the shadow. It can understand it. It can integrate it. And failure to confront the shadow is what should lead to the hero's downfall. Okay, so all that's really great, it's fun, and we've, covered it now. But how do you make sure that your myths are not just resonant, but that they're fun, they're interesting, they're not too preachy, they're not too nasty, they're just right. What are all the layers of mythic storytelling? I'm glad you asked. And you did ask, right? Okay. Let's talk about the 6 layers of creating myths. Really of creating stories, but of creating myths, since that's what we're talking about. There are 6 layers to a myth. The first layer is the literal layer, the plot layer. Okay, these are the events that happen. The farm boy goes off from the desert planet to, he sees Alderaan destroyed, his mentor gets killed, he pilots his ship and manages to destroy the Death Star. That's the literal layer. Don't neglect the literal layer for all that I've given it short shrift here. The literal layer is what helps people remember a myth, okay? Without the literal layer, people will just forget the myth. It won't be important to them. And the lack of literal layer in any given story will make it either too preachy or just So spend time on your plot, make sure your plot works. But that's basically your first layer. It's just your plot layer. Your second layer is the relationship layer. This is the layer which establishes what your culture feels about relationships. We saw that in Pahu, the importance of relationships between the father and the daughter. And you can see it in family relationships. You can see it as relationships between parents and children, humans and animals, or even in like marriage relationships, right? So I've spoken a few times about how in my world I've got this triadic marriage, this threesome marriage. And so I have myths that talk about that as a marriage principle, because establishing the relationships within a culture is part of what myths do. Okay, so we've got the literal layer, then the cultural, then the relationship layer. Then our next layer is the politics layer. Who has power and why do they have power? What is the hierarchy within your culture? So a good myth will have some establishment of hierarchy in the myth itself. Why does the king have power? Why does the queen have power? What is the kind of the reason why society is organized the way it is will be worked somewhere into the mythological political layer. Then your fourth layer is your emotional layer. And by this, I don't mean the emotions that people feel within the myth. What I mean is the emotions that the culture considers appropriate to feel. And this could be even split by like identity. So it could be that men are only allowed to feel rage and women can feel sadness, but men should hide their sadness. And in such a culture, a warrior who expresses his grief might be punished by the story because it is inappropriate for a man and a warrior to express his grief, right, in a very stoic culture. So there should be a layer of your myth that deals with how your culture feels, what your culture feels are appropriate and inappropriate emotions. And then we come to the symbolic layer of the myth. So this is about the colors your society feels, represents danger or purity or badness or whatever, like Darth Vader being in black, Leia being dressed in white, as an example. In fairy tales, why are all queens evil? They're all evil, right? Pretty much universally. Why? Because they rule alone, and the mythology emphasizes that women shouldn't be in charge. basically. And that's just, it's just a result of our history. I mean, these things are what they are. But that symbolic layer is emphasizing symbols that are important in your culture and using them at a subliminal level insofar as it can. What animals does your culture find clean and unclean? All of these things play into the symbolic level of your myth. And then the final level of your myth is the spiritual level, the metaphysical level. So myths tells us why the world is the way it is, why we are here, what purpose our lives serve, what happened before we were alive, what were we before we were born, and what happens after we die. These myths are central to that spiritual aspect of the culture. So whatever the culture believes about magic, about the journey of the soul, about all of these metaphysical concepts, that plays into the spiritual layer of myth building. So when you're building a myth, try to build it at all 6 levels. What is the myth about literally? What are the plot events? What does the myth say about relationships? What does the myth say about politics? What does the myth say about emotions? What does the myth say about symbols within the culture? And what does the myth say about the spiritual beliefs of the culture? So when you're building your myths, don't just ask what happens. Ask who wins, who loses, why do they win, why do they lose, what symbols repeat, what emotions are legitimate within this culture, what gods intervene. Myths represent the deepest truth a culture whispers about themselves. You have to understand your culture. You have to become a member of your culture in that moment, fully internalize their values, and then design the myths that speak to those values, whether or not you agree with all of them. And that is my very long ramble about myths. I hope that you enjoyed this more unscripted video. And as always, thank you very much to the members of my channel who make videos like this possible, especially the members of the Build It in Stone level: Neil Buckley, Lupix Lakeshire, Necromancer JM, Epic, Katie Kofi Mug, and Tony Lamanna, as well as the just-in-timers of the Build It in Wood and Build It in Straw levels. And if you would like to support the channel financially, consider joining the membership. But you can also just watch another video. I do have a whole playlist on myths, which I'll put over there. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World Building.